Carl Jung explained 12 signs. Your aura is too powerful for others to handle. In this video, we'll break down Carl Jung's insights into the 12 signs your aura has become too powerful for others to handle. Why your presence feels magnetic, why people react strangely around you, and why true awakening doesn't just change you. It disturbs the world around you. Jung understood that when your consciousness expands beyond the ordinary, you don't just transform yourself, you disrupt the hidden patterns of everyone you meet. Part 1. What is spiritual awakening? Through Jung's eyes. Spiritual awakening isn't about joining a religion or adopting new beliefs. In Jungian psychology, it's the natural evolution of consciousness, what he called the individuation process, taken to its deepest level. It's when the ego, that small sense of self we've carried through life, begins to dissolve into something vastly more expansive. Jung believed that most people live their entire lives identified with their persona, the mask they wear for society. But spiritual awakening occurs when this mask becomes transparent, when you begin to see through the illusions that once felt so real. You start to perceive reality not through the lens of conditioned thought, but through direct spiritual insight. This process is not comfortable. It's not peaceful in the beginning. Jung compared it to being gripped by God, a force so powerful that it completely reorganizes your psychological structure. Most people resist this transformation because it threatens everything they think they know about themselves and reality. The ego doesn't want to expand. It wants to survive. And to the ego, expansion feels like death. But Jung understood that this death is actually rebirth at a higher level of consciousness. What dies is not your essential self, but the false identities, limiting beliefs, and unconscious patterns that have kept you trapped in a smaller version of yourself. What's born is your authentic nature, what he called the self, with a capital S. The psychological roots of awakening. Jung didn't separate psychology from spirituality. To him, the psyche was inherently sacred, and mental health was inseparable from spiritual wholeness. He observed that people experiencing what he called religious experiences or spiritual awakenings often went through predictable psychological phases: disillusionment with old beliefs, a period of chaos and confusion, encounters with what he termed numinous experiences, and finally, integration into a new way of being. This process terrifies the unconscious mind because it represents the death of everything familiar. The ego doesn't want to expand. It wants to survive. And survival to the ego means maintaining the status quo, keeping things predictable and controllable. Jung spent decades studying what he called the phenomenology of the self through his work with patients, his own personal analysis, and his research into world religions and mystical traditions. He discovered that spiritual awakening follows archetypal patterns that appear across cultures and throughout history. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence that awakening is hardwired into human consciousness. The process begins when what Jung called the transcendent function activates, a psychological mechanism that bridges conscious and unconscious awareness. This usually happens during times of crisis, when ordinary ways of thinking and being no longer work. The psyche seeks a higher level of integration, and that seeking manifests as spiritual yearning, existential questioning, or profound dissatisfaction with conventional life. But here's what most people don't understand. The psyche doesn't awaken to make life easier. It awakens to make life real. And reality, as Jung discovered, includes dimensions that the rational mind cannot grasp, what he called the numinous, the sacred dimension of existence that can only be experienced, never fully explained. Why awakening disturbs others? When you begin awakening spiritually, you stop participating in collective unconsciousness. You no longer automatically accept social programming, cultural narratives, or groupthink mentalities. This creates what Jung called psychic disturbance in those around you. Think about it this way. If everyone in a room is hypnotized except you, your clarity becomes a threat to their trance. Your questions challenge their assumptions. Your peace confronts their anxiety. Your authenticity exposes their pretense. You're not trying to disturb anyone. You're simply no longer participating in collective sleep. Jung wrote extensively about how individual awakening affects the collective. When one person breaks free from unconscious patterns, it creates ripples that disturb everyone connected to them. Family members may become hostile. Friends might distance themselves. Colleagues could view you with suspicion. This isn't personal, it's archetypal. You're playing the role of what Jung called the awakener, and that archetype has always been both revered and persecuted. There's a deeper psychological mechanism at work here that Jung called projection. When people encounter someone who is awakening, they unconsciously project their own disowned spiritual potential onto that person. This creates a complex emotional response, part attraction, part repulsion. They're drawn to the light they see in you, but they're also threatened by it because it reminds them of their own unlived spiritual potential. Jung observed that most people would rather remain asleep than face the challenges that awakening requires. Spiritual growth demands that you confront your shadow, question your beliefs, and take responsibility for your inner state. It's easier to remain unconscious and blame external circumstances for your unhappiness. So when someone starts awakening, their very presence becomes a challenge to everyone who has chosen unconsciousness. This is why Jung warned that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, is often a lonely journey. Not because awakened people are antisocial, but because consciousness naturally separates you from collective unconsciousness. You begin to see through the games, the pretenses, and the illusions that most people use to navigate life. And that clarity, while liberating, can also be isolating. Part 2. The first 4 signs of spiritual awakening. Sign 1. You question everything you once believed. One of the earliest signs of spiritual awakening is the collapse of your belief system. Things you once accepted without question, religious doctrines, political ideologies, social conventions, even scientific materialism, suddenly feel hollow or incomplete. This isn't intellectual skepticism. It's a deep, visceral knowing that most of what you've been taught about reality is limited or false. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, borrowing from Christian mysticism. It's a necessary destruction that precedes reconstruction. Your old worldview must die before a more expansive one can be born. This questioning often begins subtly. Maybe you notice inconsistencies in religious teachings. Perhaps you realize that your career, while financially rewarding, feels spiritually empty. You might start seeing through political theater or recognizing how media manipulates consciousness. What's happening is that your inner wisdom is awakening, and it can no longer pretend that partial truths are complete realities. People around you may find this disturbing because your questions challenge the foundations of their own beliefs. If you start questioning the meaning of life, others are forced to confront whether their lives have meaning. If you question societal values, others must examine whether they're living authentically or merely conforming. Jung understood this as the activation of what he called the critical function, a psychological mechanism that emerges when the psyche is ready for higher levels of truth. This function doesn't destroy for the sake of destruction. It clears away illusions to make space for deeper understanding. You might find yourself unable to participate in conversations that once engaged you. Religious services might feel empty. Political discussions might seem like theater. Consumer culture might appear as manipulation. This isn't cynicism. It's clarity. Your consciousness is expanding beyond the frameworks that once contained it. The key during this phase is to remain open to truth from wherever it comes, while being discerning about what resonates with your deepening wisdom. Jung warned against both rigid skepticism and naive gullibility. The goal is not to reject everything, but to test everything against the deeper knowing that is emerging within you. Sign 2, you feel disconnected from old relationships. As your consciousness expands, you may find yourself feeling alien in relationships that once felt natural. Conversations that used to engage you now feel superficial. People you once enjoyed spending time with now seem to be operating on a completely different frequency. This isn't about judgment or superiority. It's about vibrational mismatch. Jung understood that as individuals evolve psychologically, their capacity for relationship changes. You might find yourself craving deeper, more authentic connections, while feeling increasingly uncomfortable with small talk, gossip, or surface-level interactions. This creates a painful paradox. The more awake you become, the more isolated you may feel. Family gatherings might feel like performances. Old friendships might feel like obligations. Romantic relationships might feel unfulfilling if your partner isn't also on a path of growth. Jung warned that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, often requires periods of solitude, not because you are antisocial, but because transformation happens in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. That space can feel lonely, but it's also sacred. The challenge during this phase is distinguishing between relationships that have simply run their course and those that can evolve to meet your expanding consciousness. Jung believed in what he called conscious relationship, connections based on authentic self-expression and mutual growth rather than habit, convenience, or codependency. You might find that some people in your life resist your changes and try to pull you back into old patterns of relating. They may accuse you of thinking you're better than everyone else or becoming too spiritual. This resistance comes from their own fear of change and their attachment to the version of you that felt safe and familiar. Others may be inspired by your transformation and want to know more about your journey. These are the relationships worth nurturing. Jung taught that true friendship requires both people to be committed to their own growth and to supporting each other's individuation process. During this transitional period, it's important to be patient with yourself and others. Relationships that are meant to evolve will find new ways to connect. Those that are no longer serving your highest good will naturally fall away. Trust the process, even when it feels painful. Sign 3. You experience synchronicities and meaningful coincidences. Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidences that seem to occur with increasing frequency during spiritual awakening. You might think of someone moments before they call. Books containing exactly the information you need might appear unexpectedly. Strangers might approach you with messages that feel prophetic. These aren't random events. They're signs that your consciousness is aligning with what Jung called the collective unconscious, the deeper layer of reality where all minds are connected. As your ego boundaries soften, you become more receptive to the subtle communications that are always present but usually ignored. Synchronicities serve multiple purposes during awakening. They validate that you are on the right path. They provide guidance when you are uncertain. Most importantly, they demonstrate that reality is far more interconnected and intelligent than the materialist worldview suggests. However, if you share these experiences with people who aren't awakening, they might dismiss them as coincidence or suggest you're becoming too spiritual or even delusional. This is because synchronicities threaten the rational cause and effect worldview that most people use to navigate reality. Jung spent decades documenting synchronistic experiences, both his own and those of his patients. He discovered that synchronicities increase during times of psychological transformation because the psyche is more open to non-rational forms of communication. When you're in the process of awakening, your consciousness becomes more permeable to what he called causal connections. Meaningful relationships between events that can't be explained by linear causation. These experiences often carry emotional resonance that goes far beyond their surface content. A chance encounter might provide exactly the insight you needed. A book might fall open to a page that speaks directly to your current situation. An animal might appear repeatedly, carrying symbolic meaning that your unconscious mind recognizes even if your rational mind doesn't understand. The key to working with synchronicities is developing what Jung called symbolic attitude. the ability to perceive meaning beyond literal content. This requires a different kind of thinking than our culture typically values. Instead of asking, "How did this happen?" you learn to ask, "What does this mean?" Instead of seeking logical explanations, you become curious about deeper patterns and connections. Some people become obsessed with synchronicities and start seeing meaningful connections everywhere. Jung warned against this tendency, which he called inflation. The goal isn't to find meaning in every coincidence, but to recognize when genuine synchronicities are providing guidance or confirmation about your spiritual path. Sign 4. You develop heightened sensitivity and intuition. During spiritual awakening, your perceptual abilities often expand dramatically. You might become more sensitive to energy, emotions, and environmental factors. Crowded places might feel overwhelming. You could find yourself picking up on other people's thoughts or feelings without trying. Your dreams might become more vivid and symbolic. This heightened sensitivity isn't a disorder. It's an upgrade. Jung believed that what psychology often pathologizes as too sensitive is actually evidence of expanded consciousness. You're not becoming more fragile. You're becoming more permeable to subtle dimensions of reality. Your intuition, what Jung called the bridge between conscious and unconscious knowledge, becomes remarkably accurate. You might know things without knowing how you know them. You could sense when people are lying, predict outcomes, or feel guided toward certain decisions. This creates challenges in a world that values logical thinking over intuitive knowing. People might accuse you of being too emotional or impractical. They may discount your insights because you can't always explain them rationally. But Jung understood that logic and intuition are meant to work together, not in opposition. Part 3, Signs 5 to 8, The Deepening Process. Sign 5, you lose interest in material pursuits. As spiritual awakening deepens, your relationship with material possessions, status symbols, and external achievements fundamentally shifts. Things that once motivated you, wealth accumulation, career advancement, social recognition, begin to feel empty or even meaningless. This isn't about rejecting material life entirely, but rather seeing through the illusion that external things can provide lasting fulfillment. Jung observed that spiritual awakening often involves what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and see beyond either-or thinking. You might still work, earn money, and enjoy beautiful things, but your identity is no longer dependent on them. You realize that happiness comes from within, that peace cannot be purchased, and that your worth isn't determined by your achievements. This shift often disturbs family members and friends who are still identified with material success. They might worry about your lack of ambition or try to remotivate you toward conventional goals. What they don't understand is that you haven't lost ambition. You've redirected it toward spiritual growth and authentic self-expression. Jung understood this as the emergence of what he called spiritual values over material values. This doesn't mean spirituality is superior to materialism, but rather that a person undergoing awakening naturally prioritizes inner development over external accumulation. You might find yourself questioning consumer culture, recognizing how advertising manipulates desire, or feeling overwhelmed by the amount of possessions you own. This isn't asceticism, it's discrimination. You're learning to distinguish between what serves your authentic self and what merely feeds ego desires. Some people interpret this shift as depression or loss of motivation, but Jung recognized it as a natural part of the individuation process. As you connect with your deeper purpose, superficial goals lose their appeal. This can create a temporary period of disorientation as you discover what actually matters to you. The key during this transition is patience with yourself and trust in the process. New forms of motivation will emerge as you align with your authentic values. Work that felt meaningless might become a vehicle for service. Money might become a tool for freedom rather than an end in itself. Possessions might become expressions of beauty rather than symbols of status. Sign 6. You feel called to serve something greater. During awakening, most people develop what Jung called a religious attitude, not toward organized religion necessarily, but toward life itself as sacred. You begin to feel that your life has a deeper purpose beyond personal satisfaction or survival. This calling might manifest as a desire to help others heal, to create art that inspires, to protect the environment, or to work for social justice. The specific form doesn't matter as much as the underlying motivation. You feel connected to something larger than your individual existence. Jung believed this was evidence of what he called the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends the personal ego. When you connect with the self, your individual life becomes a vehicle for transpersonal purpose. However, this shift toward service can create conflict with people who are still operating from purely personal motivations. They might not understand why you'd choose meaningful work over high-paying work, or why you care so much about causes that don't directly benefit you. Sign 7. You experience periods of intense solitude. Spiritual awakening often requires extended periods of alone time, not from depression or antisocial tendencies, but from a deep need to integrate new levels of consciousness. Jung called this the hermit phase of individuation. During these periods, you might feel drawn to meditation, contemplation, journaling, or simply being in nature. Social obligations can feel burdensome. Small talk becomes nearly impossible. You need space to process the profound shifts happening within your psyche. This can be misunderstood by others as depression, isolation, or rejection. People might try to pull you back into social activities before you're ready. They may interpret your need for solitude as withdrawal from them personally. But Jung understood that psychological transformation requires incubation periods, times when the psyche turns inward to reorganize itself at deeper levels. These aren't signs of pathology. They're necessary phases of spiritual development. Sign 8. You see through social programming and conditioning. As awakening progresses, you develop what Jung might have called conscious discrimination, the ability to see how much of human behavior is unconsciously programmed rather than consciously chosen. You recognize how advertising manipulates desires, how media shapes opinions, how social pressure influences decisions. This isn't paranoia or conspiracy thinking. It's clear perception of how conditioning works. You see how people unconsciously repeat patterns learned in childhood, how cultures perpetuate themselves through unconscious transmission of values and beliefs. This clarity can feel isolating because you're no longer participating unconsciously in collective patterns. You might find yourself unable to engage in conversations about celebrities, consumer trends, or political drama because you see these as distractions from more meaningful concerns. Others might perceive this as arrogance or judgment, but it's actually the natural result of expanded awareness. Once you see the matrix of conditioning, you can't unsee it. Part 4, Signs 9 to 12, the integration phase. Sign 9, you experience ego death and rebirth cycles. One of the most profound aspects of spiritual awakening is experiencing what Jung called ego death, moments when your ordinary sense of self temporarily dissolves, revealing the deeper consciousness that lies beneath personal identity. These experiences can happen during meditation, in nature, through creative expression, or sometimes spontaneously. For a moment, the boundaries between self and universe disappear. You realize that the you thought you were is just a tiny wave in an infinite ocean of consciousness. These ego death experiences are followed by periods of rebirth, times when you must reconstruct your sense of self from a more expanded perspective. Each cycle takes you deeper into authentic being and further from conditioned identity. People who haven't experienced this might find your descriptions of ego dissolution frightening or incomprehensible. They might worry about your mental stability or try to convince you that such experiences are dangerous. Jung studied these experiences extensively and recognized them as natural psychological phenomena that occur during profound spiritual transformation. He distinguished between pathological dissociation, where the ego fragments due to trauma, and transcendent experiences, where the ego temporarily dissolves into expanded consciousness. During ego death, you might experience complete loss of personal identity, dissolution of body boundaries, or merger with universal consciousness. These states can be accompanied by profound peace, overwhelming love, or direct knowing of spiritual truths that can't be communicated in words. The rebirth phase often involves integrating insights from these expanded states into ordinary consciousness. This can be challenging because ego death experiences reveal the relative nature of everything the ego considers important. You must learn to function in the world while carrying the memory of states where personal concerns completely dissolved. Jung warned about what he called inflation, the tendency to identify with expanded states rather than integrating them. Some people become addicted to ego death experiences and avoid the difficult work of bringing transcendent insights into daily life. Others become convinced they're enlightened and lose the humility necessary for continued growth. The healthy approach is to honor these experiences as glimpses of your deeper nature while remaining grounded in human reality. Each ego death rebirth cycle provides an opportunity to release limiting identities and align more closely with your authentic self. Sign 10. You develop compassion for human suffering. Paradoxically, as you transcend personal drama, you develop deeper compassion for the universal human condition. You see how most suffering comes from unconsciousness, how people hurt others because they're in pain themselves, how the ego creates separation and conflict. This compassion extends to everyone, including people who previously annoyed or angered you. You begin to see their behavior as symptoms of spiritual unconsciousness rather than personal attacks. However, this compassion must be balanced with wisdom. Jung emphasized the importance of conscious suffering, feeling pain without being overwhelmed by it, maintaining boundaries while keeping your heart open. Sign 11. You feel both ancient and newly born. During advanced stages of awakening, you might experience a strange temporal paradox, feeling simultaneously ancient, as if you've existed forever, and newly born, as if you're seeing the world for the first time. Jung would have understood this as connection to what he called the collective unconscious, the deep layers of psyche that contain the accumulated wisdom of humanity. You tap into knowledge that feels ancient, because it is ancient, passed down through countless generations of human experience. At the same time, you're experiencing reality from a fresh perspective, free from many of the filters and assumptions that previously limited your perception. Sign 12. You embody paradox and non-dual awareness. The final sign of spiritual awakening is the ability to hold paradox without needing to resolve it into either-or thinking. You can be deeply engaged with life while remaining detached from outcomes. You can feel profound love while maintaining clear boundaries. You can be fully human while knowing yourself as something beyond human. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity to integrate opposites into a larger whole. It's the hallmark of psychological and spiritual maturity. This non-dual awareness often confuses people who think in binary terms. They might find your responses unpredictable or your perspective incomprehensible because you're no longer operating from fixed positions or rigid beliefs. Part 5. Navigating awakening with wisdom, protecting your process. Spiritual awakening makes you vulnerable in certain ways. Your increased sensitivity, your questioning of social norms, your periods of uncertainty, all of these can be misunderstood or even exploited by others. Jung emphasized the importance of discrimination during this process. Not everyone needs to understand your journey. Not every spiritual teacher or community is authentic. Not every mystical experience needs to be shared or explained. The first protection is silence about certain aspects of your process. Jung himself was extremely careful about sharing his own visionary experiences, knowing they could be misinterpreted or misused. Learn to distinguish between people who can support your awakening and those who might undermine it through ignorance or jealousy. Develop what Jung called psychological boundaries. This means maintaining your own center while remaining open to guidance and connection. You can be compassionate without absorbing others' emotions. You can be open-hearted without being naive about human nature. Be especially cautious during vulnerable phases of your awakening. When you are in the midst of ego dissolution or integration, you're more susceptible to spiritual manipulation or psychological invasion. This is why many wisdom traditions emphasize the importance of having genuine teachers and supportive community during spiritual transformation. The importance of grounding. One of Jung's key insights was that spiritual experiences must be integrated into ordinary consciousness to be truly transformative. He warned against spiritual inflation, the tendency to identify with expanded states, rather than embodying their wisdom in daily life. Grounding practices become essential during awakening. This might include physical exercise, time in nature, creative expression, or service to others. The goal is to bring heaven to earth, not to escape earth for heaven. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called active imagination, a practice of dialoguing with unconscious contents through imagery, writing, or artistic expression. This helps integrate spiritual insights and prevents them from remaining as isolated peak experiences. Working with the shadow. During awakening, spiritual awakening often intensifies shadow work, the process of integrating disowned aspects of the psyche. As your consciousness expands, you become more aware of your own unconscious patterns, repressed emotions, and denied impulses. Jung warned against spiritual bypassing, using spiritual practices to avoid psychological work. True awakening requires facing your shadow, not transcending it. This means acknowledging your capacity for selfishness, anger, jealousy, and other unspiritual emotions. The shadow often becomes more visible during awakening, because expanded consciousness illuminates everything, including what you'd prefer not to see about yourself. This can be humbling and sometimes disturbing, but it's essential for authentic spiritual development. Remember that shadow integration doesn't mean acting out negative impulses. It means acknowledging them consciously so they don't control you unconsciously. Jung believed that what you resist persists, while what you accept can transform. Integration and embodiment. The goal of awakening isn't to transcend human life, but to bring higher consciousness into everyday existence. Jung called this bringing the unconscious to consciousness and making it a living reality. This means continuing to work, love, create, and engage with the world, but from an awakened perspective. It means being spiritual without being impractical, conscious without being condescending, open-hearted without being naive. Your role as a bridge. As someone undergoing spiritual awakening, you serve as a bridge between ordinary consciousness and expanded awareness. Your very existence demonstrates that transformation is possible, that there are dimensions of reality beyond what most people imagine. This is both a gift and a responsibility. Your journey doesn't just belong to you. It serves the collective evolution of consciousness. By continuing to grow, integrate, and embody awakened awareness, you make it easier for others to find their own path to spiritual freedom. Remember, awakening isn't a destination but a continuous process of becoming more conscious, more authentic, and more aligned with the deepest truth of who you are. Trust the process, even when others don't understand it. Your spiritual awakening is not just personal transformation. It's a contribution to the awakening of all humanity.